Welcome to this presentation of the Rotary Club of North Bethesda, Maryland, USA. Our club was established in 1974. We meet every Friday morning at 7:45 a.m., and we often invite guest speakers to give presentations on all kinds of interesting subjects. Please contact us through our website at nbrotary.org. And thanks for watching. Our speaker today is Ralph Buglass, and he will be introduced by North Bethesda Rotary Club member Kevin Flynn.
Attempted murder, business partnerships gone bad, feuding of families, and the end of slavery. Speaker. Oh, here he is. It's Ralph Buglass, very good, who is a frequent speaker for Montgomery History, the Montgomery Historical Society. He's written several books. He teaches lifelong learning courses at American University, Johns Hopkins, Montgomery College, and Frederick Community College. A native of Montgomery County, where he learned all these stories. He graduated from Winston Churchill High School and has a BA from Cornell and master's from American University. Ralph?
Well, that's a lot to live up to. Paul, if you can get the slides on. We'll be going back to the early history of Potomac, Potomac Village, and the story involves, well, what Kevin just talked about. For me, it is, it turns out, some family history. I did not realize until I started doing some family research, genealogy, tracing, like so many people these days have gotten involved in with the census online. It's easier now to do these things. I had no idea this family history. My father was very interested in his family history, but this is all through my mother's side. I knew my grandmother, her maiden name was Offutt, and Potomac was once Offutt's Crossroads. So, but you see in the slide there, the stone wall. If you drive through Potomac, of course, the intersection of River Road and Falls Road. Potomac Village, established 1880. Well, it goes back much further than that. Next slide.
I have to just add that the little box on the side is an artifact of the computer, and I can't do anything about it.
All right, we'll hope it doesn't cut too much out. Well, as you know, Potomac is, as I just said, so we'll move on, Paul. Next slide, Paul. And of course, you know that Potomac has a certain reputation as being, next slide also, being a quite affluent place and a quite well-educated place. Next. And today it is, well, it's an intersection, but on all four corners of the intersection, you'll find a shopping center. So just click through this, Paul.
Very expensive gas.
Yes, and you see, it's hard to see there, the Exxon station at the top. Let's go ahead and I'll mention that. And on, well, actually, technically 3 shopping centers. On the 4th corner, there is an old store, which I'll mention coming up, that is now owned by a bank. And just continue to click through. And because it is such a wealthy place, there's lots of opportunity for, and I hope, I know at least one person here lives in Potomac, so I'm
Several of our members.
okay, I have to apologize here.
I worked at the Carter Rock lab for my career, so I'm familiar with this area.
I grew up.
I drove through there once.
Right on. So you need easy access to your money. Let's go ahead. But if it weren't for the story that I mentioned the Exxon station with all those other commercial establishments, and Potomac being the quite wealthy area that it is, it's interesting to note that probably the most well-known community institution is that gas station. And you see there, Mitch and Bill's. It's not called the Exxon station, it's Mitch and Bill's. And for us long-timers, that's go back to the 2 owners, Mitch and Bill. And one of their sons is running the gas station today.
I knew Mitch.
There you have it. Yes, indeed. But before that gas station was there, and that was really the first modern building to come along, another reason why it's the community institution. There was a store there, and it was the Offutt General Store. So let's go back even further. Go ahead. We're going back in time. As I said, it was once Offutt's Crossroads. That's for the founding family of Potomac. An English immigrant was given a land grant of several hundred acres, which included that area, William Offutt. He had something like 11 children, and those children were equally prolific, shall we say, and so it became a very large family spread all over the country. But it so happens that about 3 generations later, one of those descendants still had some of the property right there in Potomac. So go ahead, Paul. And it remained Offutt's Crossroads because of the founding family there. Go ahead, Paul. Again. And still again. So as I said, it's family history for me. We are now up to actually 3 generations in, but this shows 5 generations ago. So it was my great-great-grandfather, unbeknownst to me, who was the line of the Offutt, the branch of the tree that was still living in Potomac and had quite a sizable farm. It was called a plantation, originally a tobacco plantation. Tobacco was the main crop in our area, but it wears out the soil, and so.
So they had slaves. He had slaves.
Indeed, that was part of the story. I never knew that part of the story either. So it was a plantation, and in looking at the census, 1840 is when I started, and indeed, there it showed about 12 enslaved people on that property. It was several hundred acres. So go ahead. Continue through. So if it weren't for the story that I'm telling you, I think that it has to do with the scattering of the Offutt family, the loss of their prominence in the community, largely through family feuding over that land. Not a atypical story in family, so go ahead.
Can you tell us where the land was exactly?
I'll show a map coming up. So, as I said, if it weren't for this story, I think that there might still be there might somehow still, it might even still be called Offutt's Crossroads, or perhaps Offuttville, or some variation of the name. And go ahead. And I don't think Offuttville quite has the same cachet as Potomac. I mean, I know none of you watch this, but I don't think, go ahead. I don't think anyone would really be interested in tuning into the Real Housewives of Offuttville. So let's go ahead with it. Now, a number of communities in Montgomery County, I wanted to expand this a little beyond just Potomac, are indeed named for the original founding families. You see them there, but go ahead. Since I'm speaking to the North Bethesda Rotary Club, I trust you all know that Bethesda was once known by a different name also.
No.
Go ahead. Here is the answer. It was once Darcy's store, for the lone commercial establishment that was in Bethesda before all those high rises, now going up. Darcy's store right at what is now Wisconsin Avenue and on Georgetown Road. Well, you failed your quiz, so pay attention now. Go ahead.
Country store that
Yes, a small general store.
that's there now.
No, the art, no, it wasn't that, it preceded.
You know where the old post office building was?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, near that intersection. So I've been stressing feuding family, go ahead. As I said, we're going back to the late 1600s. William Offutt was the patriarch who came over from England, had the colonial land grant. Go ahead. Let's move up to the early 1800s. Go ahead. So that is now the branch of the family that is still there. My great-great-great-grandfather. And unlike his ancestors, who I said had a large families, he had only one son. And that son was Thomas Marshall Offutt. I need to use middle names to keep them straight. And Thomas Marshall Offutt had a store right there in Potomac. So here's the map. Go ahead. River Road and then Great Falls Road, now just called Falls Road. So this was the large plantation that Thomas Levi Offutt owned, stretching from right in the Crossroads, well, if you know the area, well beyond Morton Road, so several hundred acres. His son ran the general store right at the Crossroads, the gas station, Mitch and Bill's is today, and lived diagonally across the street with his growing family. Again, that's where the store was, so go ahead. Yes, diagonally across the street is this quite grand residence. This grand residence is not where my now great-great-grandfather lived, running the store diagonally across the street, but it figures a little in the story coming up. Go ahead. He lived in a much smaller wooden house. So 1855, two events occur. Thomas Marshall Offutt, the son who's running the store, well, a distant relative of his wife decides to open a rival store across the street. Now, I should mention that Potomac is, a very small community at this point. Less than 100 people live there. Almost everyone knows everyone else, well, practically related to everyone. So this was a distant relative who decides to open a rival store. Thomas Marshall Offutt apparently doesn't like the idea of competition, and he shoots the rival store owner, Horatio Claggett. Now I'm showing Horatio Claggett's tombstone, which is in Potomac Methodist Church Cemetery. He did not kill Horatio Claggett, but he was charged with attempted murder. Horatio Claggett died later. But so he was off to prison, leaving his wife to take care of the store. The other thing, 1855, his father, the plantation owner, is nearing the end of his life. He writes a will, and he leaves the plantation to his wife, not surprisingly, but apparently is quite upset with his son. He disowns, he writes in his will, "I leave to my son, Thomas M. Offutt, $1 and no more of my estate." But to his daughter-in-law, he leaves the store and where she's living. So go ahead. So his wife now owns the plantation. She also is nearing the end of her life. She writes a will and essentially leaves it to her three granddaughters. Now I said Thomas Marshall Offutt and his wife had a growing family, 3 boys and 3 girls. Their grandmother leaves the plantation to her 3 daughters. I think, wow, something a bit early feminist. For the 3 grandsons, she leaves several $100s for their education. I guess she figures that in those days, a man's world, they can take care of themselves. She's going to watch out for her granddaughters. So indeed, she dies 1859. Go ahead. The granddaughters now have the property. Well, the Civil War breaks out. Yes, that Civil War, but go ahead, Paul. Also the Civil War in the Offutt family. So go ahead. It turns out that, well, the 3 granddaughters, 2 are approaching marrying age, and but one is quite young. So how are they going to run a plantation? They decide to sell the plantation, probably with a lot of their mother's urging, to their other grandmother, the mother of their mother. I know it gets all very confusing. I'm trying to simplify it as much as possible. These feuds are very involved. So they sell it to their other grandmother, who also owns a farm in Potomac. Remember, farming, Potomac is mainly just farm area. And but with apparently with all the disruption of the Civil War, when indeed troops were marching through, their grandmother is not able to come up with the money. It was, I think, something like $600 for several hundred acres in Potomac, Maryland.
Go back
She's
in.
not able to come up, and so what ultimately occurs is that there is a court suit, and the court orders the property to be sold, and that's what you're seeing here. Trustee sale ordered by the court. 260 acres of land, good frame dwelling. Go ahead, I think maybe I have this enlarged a little, yes. And I underlined a few things, so go ahead.
Cheap transportation.
It's one of the best farms in the county, and one more, go ahead, Paul. And if that's not enough to entice you, there might be gold there. Let's go ahead. You probably know, of course, that there was gold in the Potomac area. Go ahead. Stems from a Civil War. A Union soldier from California had been stationed in the hills above Great Falls, washing out some pots and pans, and saw something that looked like gold. He knew because, as I said, he'd been in the California gold rush. He came back, bought up property around there, and opened the Maryland gold mine. Just remnants only exist today. Go ahead.
It's in the property, Great Falls proper.
It is in the C&O Canal National Park, and you can walk in there. There's a fence around what's left. This actually is an older photograph, and even the wood, it's now gone, so it's only the concrete that held up the water tower for the gold mine. But it set off something of a gold rush in Potomac. Go ahead, Paul. You can see it's Potomac by this point. There's the Maryland gold mine, but you see a number of other smaller mines all around Potomac. So that explains why Potomac is the wealthy place that it is today. I'm glad you found that. Yes, because that's not really true. So it never really produced a whole lot of gold.
Do you know why the name changed to do?
Here we come. Boy, you're leading me right along.
Set up a question there.
Yes, go ahead. So as this says, never really a whole lot of gold there, but one of the most interesting geological sites of the area. Go ahead, Paul. So again, back to that trustee sale, the land is now sold out of family, you might say. It's bought by a Captain John McDonald, who had been in the Civil War, immigrant from Ireland. Just hold that thought for a moment. Let's go ahead. Now, I should have said that in the will in which Thomas Levi Offutt left the store and the house to his daughter-in-law, he said this bequest will only be good as long as she is the wife or widow of my, parentheses, disowned son. And lo and behold, you see that little red dot there on the right, which is now nicely circled by the rectangle. So that is helpful. Let's go ahead. Living there is a neighbor who she marries, and so remember, she is not the wife or widow of her father-in-law's son. So the provision of that will was that if she is no longer the wife or widow, then that property that he has left to her, right in the intersection of Potomac Village today, is to be divided among all his, is to be sold and to be the proceeds divided among all his grandchildren, the 6 grandchildren that I mentioned. And so don't you know, by this time, the 2 oldest daughters are indeed married, and they take their mother to court to order to have that property sold, just like the will specified. And now I embellish a little. Do I have enough time to embellish a little? They're actually Lois Offutt, Thomas Marshall wife's. They're actually her stepdaughters. He had a first wife and she died, and so I don't know, evil stepdaughters. But the plaintiffs in the lawsuit actually are their now husbands. So I don't know, maybe again those dastardly husbands after the money. Who knows? So there is yet another court suit about property And lo and behold, Lois's own oldest son, my great-grandfather, who I never knew, joins his stepsisters in this suit. He sends a petition to the court in Rockville saying that any proceeds that might come his way, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little ahead. He joins in the suit. He says, I fully support what the plaintiffs in the suit are saying, that indeed the property should be sold. Well, his next younger brother also sends a petition to the court. He says any proceeds that should come my way as a result of this lawsuit should go to my mother for the natural love and affection that I have for her. Sort of take that, big brother. Yes. Well, the court finally rules in 1870 here that, yes, the property should be sold. Although Lois sends a petition also, no one testifies apparently. And luckily they send the petition because I wouldn't have a court transcript back from those days. I have all this from records in the Maryland archives, believe it or not. There's several inches thick. The court rules that indeed the property is to be sold. Well, who buys it? It turns out the mother, Lois, buys the property back. Something of a surprise, because remember she had married that neighbor nearby, but the house is no longer there because they have moved to Washington by this point. Why does she want this land now in Potomac? I have no idea. No diaries were left. But she in turn sells it to her brother. Remember, it's all an extended family. And her brother in turn sells the store to his nephew, her oldest son, the one who joined his stepsisters in the lawsuit. So Winfield Offutt, my great-grandfather, now owns the store that his father once ran in Potomac. He later builds a larger store. Keep going through here. I think you come to the, Winfield Offutt store. Go ahead. Oh, yeah, we don't have a photograph of it, but we do have this drawing of the store. So this one stood where Mitch and Bill's gas station is today. Go ahead.
Second floor.
Yes, it had a second floor, and probably where they lived, but eventually they built what has been described as a quite grand stone house behind it, where the little strip mall is today, about where the Potomac Library is today.
That one's still there.
This one is still here. Now, a little side to the story is, so Winfield Offutt is, settling into life in his store there. He also has a growing family, which includes my grandmother, who was born in what is still Offutt's Crossroads. So I'll get to how the name changed here in just a moment. 1880, again, two important things happen. Another rival store opens across the street, just like had so bedeviled Winfield Offutt's father. This is a different store than what Horatio Claggett opened, and this one still stands. This was run by Edgar Perry, who had actually been in partnership with Winfield Offutt in that one store for a while, but that partnership dissolved, and so Perry opened a store across the street. He eventually became the postmaster, and it eventually housed the post office. So of course, no mail delivery in those days. You come to the post office, pick up your mail, and when you're in the store there, you pick up some items. And so this store became more prosperous than the store of his former partner across the street. It does still stand today, and it's been nicely restored. It is owned by Capital Bank, which has all the ATMs behind it. Let's go ahead, Paul. The other is finally the name change of Potomac. And this is where Captain John McDonald comes back in. He has become something of a community leader. Of course, he owns a large chunk of property now. He'll later become controller of the state of Maryland and the first Republican congressman from that area. So the post office comes to him and says, we need a new name for Offutt's Crossroads. That's too much of a mouthful. It's too long a name. And furthermore, there are too many other localities that have the word crossroads in their name. So let's go ahead. And so Offutt's Crossroads, the name falls into oblivion. Go ahead, Paul. Because Captain John McDonald picks the name Potomac, most likely for the river nearby. So the river comes in a little bit in this way, Clark. But the only other community actually in Montgomery County itself that did have the word crossroads in its name, and again, like Bethesda and Darcy's store, Wheaton once had an earlier name. It was once Mitchell's Crossroads, since most of these small communities lay at the intersections of important roads. So that was about the only one. And I would note that across the river, Bailey's Crossroads has survived.
Right.
But alas, Offutt's Crossroads does not survive. It becomes known as Potomac, and Potomac ever since. And few people today know it as Offutt's Crossroads. So the store there, Winfield Offutt, is continuing. His family is growing, as I said. The small shopping center behind the gas station is probably where my grandmother was born, or about where the library is today.
You got 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I think I can do it. Go ahead. Now, we would take Sunday drives in the countryside when my grandmother was alive, and she would point out spots around Old Potomac. Oh, if I had only asked her then, you know, it's the lament that so many people now if I had only asked my parents, if I had only asked my grandparents, how much I could have come up with. Let's just go right through that. That says that Perry's store became quite prominent. Go ahead. And it was his son who actually built this quite grand house, which still stands right there in Potomac. Was a real estate office. It's now become another bank.
That's where the money is.
Yes. So finally, 1885, there's yet another court-ordered sale of a remaining piece of the original Offutt property. And this sale, it's an auction held right in front of Winfield Offutt's store. It stems from the original petition of one of those stepdaughters, Elizabeth Offutt, and right in front of Winfield Offutt's store. And the other part of it that I want to read from this court-ordered sale is, it presages what Potomac is going to become from this lot, from its proximity to the village of now Potomac, is most desirable property for making a home in a good neighborhood.
Cheap on it.
So there you see Captain John McDonald's property, quite extensive in what is now the village of Potomac. Off to the right is what my great-grandfather was able to eventually purchase, the store and some property behind the store. But in 1893, he decides to sell and move to Washington. And so I can't help but be somewhat wistful of if that property were still in the Offutt family, which I am somewhat a direct descendant, but there are many others. I can't help but be wistful of what that might be worth today. And I admit sometimes when I drive into Potomac, I think that all these squatters should get off my land. Except for the other part of the story, which indeed you alluded to, which was slavery. And so my ancestors owned enslaved people, threw me totally for a loop. I almost wanted to disown them as much as Thomas Levi Offutt disowned his son. But in fact, slavery was a big part of Potomac's story. It was a big part of Montgomery County's story. So important to remember. So I'll just conclude with that is, I hope, a somewhat interesting story. Family history, a family feud type story, but I think those are always interesting. But if it weren't for that, who knows? It might still be Offutt's Crossroads. And even the Post, many years ago, had fun with the name Potomac. As you see there, front page story, what's in a name? Plenty, if the name is Potomac. And of course, there are many Potomac wannabes. I actually live in Rockville, but in a subdivision called Potomac Woods. There's North Potomac, and so might be North Offuttaville.
One question, did any of the slaves take up the name of Offutt?
I actually tried to trace the enslaved people.
I know one African American.
Yes, and I have been contacted by African Americans who have the name Offutt, and we're trying to trace the history. But that's another part of the story for African American families in tracing family history. The Civil War is strictly like a brick wall because of not really having, so we don't know for sure. It's one of those what ifs.
Well, thank you very much.
I have a question.
Yeah, we do the questions in a second here. Okay, to conclude the meeting, and you can stay for more questions afterwards. We have to close the meeting at 8:30. I think we have people who have time constraints here. Well, thank you very much. Very interesting. If you go
So
out,
now I can take questions.
if you go out River Road towards Poolsville, there's an Offutt's Road out there.
Yes,
Is
West
that related
Offutt
to your
Road.
family?
I don't know. I assume so because the William Offutt was the original patriarch of the family. You may know another William Offutt, who is a speaker for Montgomery History. He lives in Bethesda and was a longtime social studies teacher at Leland Junior High School. We're going back here. So he actually has the patriarch's name, William Offutt. We've spoken, but as he says, it's a large family, so we're different branches of the tree, as it were. There's an Offutt Air Force Base in, is it Oklahoma or Arizona? I can't remember. Out west there somewhere, across the Potomac River. And there's also an Offutt's Island in the Potomac, now owned by the Potomac a conservation group. So a lot of Offutts and even black Offutts, as I said, and a large extended family.
Did you ever meet I'm sorry, was your hand up?
I'll go next.
Okay, there was a mechanic at Mitcham Mills, a black man, who was also a jockey. Could he be connected to the office?
Leonard Jackson.
Yes, Leonard.
Something of an institution in Potomac also. Yes, the Black Jackson family is equally a longtime family, or was, of Potomac. And I went to school with one of the, then my age also, younger generation. Again, I simply don't know. Doesn't have the name, and I do, from the will, I do actually have the names of the enslaved people, first names only. But even that is so valuable to African-American families. I attended a workshop about tracing family history, and the presenter made a point of saying that wills, it's surprising, wills of those who held enslaved people are actually a valuable resource, ironically enough, because it does at least provide some names. And I did find, I couldn't go into all the details, but if you have a few moments, the will of Sarah Offutt, the wife of the original plantation owner, she actually freed some of the enslaved people. So I said she was something of a feminist. Also, quite commendably, she freed some of the people. But again, this is the heart-wrenching aspect of slavery. Several she freed outright, and I was able to trace them to the 1870 census, living further north, about where Tobytown is today. And so maybe a connection. But also I said heart-wrenching because she also specified that, and I think I'm quoting here, my Negro boy, I don't remember the name, John, 5 years old, shall be freed when he reaches the age of 30. So it's quite heart-wrenching too. It's as I say, it's a part of Montgomery County's history, and part of history that we are reckoning still with today.
You know, I have worked and lived around that area since the 60s. And so I recognize some of the history you're talking about there. One thing in particular that's kind of interesting is we dug up the location of some of those gold mines. There's various exploratory pits that we dug all around Brickyard Road in that area. And I actually discovered one and we climbed into it about 100 feet shaft that somebody had dug looking for.
You're a brave man.
And you got.
Yeah.
There's a trail.
A question or comment, I guess. My great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother, back in Ireland in the 1850s, was a McDonald. And at some point, we lived in Potomac. That's why I figure now with this connection to McDonald's, I was returning to that, the family.
Yes, well, there's a little genealogy project for you if you wish to undertake.
He was the rich guy too, right?
Yes, Captain John McDonald, who bought
Bought
the plantation, later became, as I said, controller of Maryland and a congressman.
I remember also when the Perry store was sold, it was a pharmacy and it was sold out. And they opened up the whole building for anybody to come in and buy all the drugs and everything that were there. They had a big, I remember a big pint jar of caffeine, things like that, that were put on sale to the public.
Well, I do give a longer version of this talk, and I do have a receipt from the Offutt store showing coffee for about, I don't know, 10 cents or something a pound. But Klaus, if you want to mention something else about that store, feel free.
Well, for example, the guy who's flipping burgers at Tally Ho used to flip the burgers at the far end of the pharmacy right across from St. Francis. And the pharmacist was known as Doc. I don't remember his last name.
Well, I thought you were going to add the story that the Perry store is something of a historic landmark in Potomac now. And when Falls Road was widened several decades ago, the store was actually moved back a little to make way for the roadway. So, but it was preserved.
You get this stamped right next door.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else? I hope that.
You might mention, you know, the Josiah Henson facility. Can you mention something about that? Yes,
and that helps to tell the story of slavery in our county. This is a new county park, Josiah Henson Park on Old Georgetown Road, just a little before Rockville Pike. It tells the story of Josiah Henson, who was enslaved in our county. Josiah Henson was not able to read or write, but he eventually escaped to Canada and helped to form a resettlement community there. But more importantly, that autobiography that he wrote, which described conditions here in Montgomery County, was read by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who then wrote, largely based on Josiah Henson's life. She has a second book called, she wrote the quite influential novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And people doubted its authenticity, so she later wrote a lesser known book called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, in which she listed all her sources. And indeed, she identifies Josiah Henson as largely the model for the character Uncle Tom. Now, Uncle Tom is considered a derogatory expression today, but in the novel, he is quite a heroic character.
Is that the cabin that's at the Smithsonian?
No, that's a different cabin, but on the site of Josiah Henson Park, part of it is a log cabin. And that was often, back in the day, often referred to as Uncle Tom's Cabin. Since the county has bought that property and turned it into a quite well-done museum, the cabin has been preserved, but archaeology and what's called dendrochronology, which is dating of the wood, has determined that that log cabin actually post-dates the time that Josiah Henson was on the property. But they have done, as I said, archaeology, and there's a large stone chimney, and they found several floors, so they believe that there was probably an earlier cabin, and being the kitchen cabin, it could easily have caught fire at some point. And so it's very much tied to, that whole property is very much tied to Josiah Henson.
Now, Montrose Parkway has recently been renamed Josiah Henson Parkway. And I see that, yeah, most people don't call it that, but officially that's the name now.
Yes, and
Kind of like Clara Barton Parkway.
yes,
Yeah.
it was renamed to honor Josiah Henson and his importance in Montgomery County, or at least having been in Montgomery County. Charles Woodward High School, which some of you may remember on Old Georgetown Road, it's been torn down, it's being rebuilt. It was Tilden Middle School for a long time. Right. There is some consideration being given to when that school reopens, rather than reopening it as a Charles Woodward High School, it possibly may reopen as Josiah Henson High School. That is, for me as a historian, that's a bit of a conundrum, because Charles Woodward, again, not very well known, but was a judge in our county who ruled in a very important case, which I also give a talk about, but not very well known, involving the unequal teacher salaries in our county. That is, unequal between the black teachers and the white teachers when our schools were segregated. And the case was brought by a public school teacher, black public school teacher in Rockville, a few blocks from the courthouse where it was held. But more importantly, that case brought to Montgomery County a young Thurgood Marshall to argue on behalf of the black teachers. And Judge Charles Woodward ruled a very preliminary ruling. It didn't quite go all the way, but he ruled in favor of hearing the whole case, which a professor at the University of Maryland says is the first, essentially the first ruling toward overturning school segregation in the entire country, right here in Montgomery County. So we have some important history stemming from.
And when was that?
Stemming from our black history. That ruling was 1937. And actually, Thurgood Marshall then continued this quest for equal teacher salaries as part of the whole effort to overturn school segregation. It's not very well known. You often hear about the law schools being desegregated first as part of ultimately Brown versus Board of Education. So I give a talk about Montgomery County being the first step toward Brown versus Board of Education.
Very interesting.
Well, thank you all for
Thank you.
It's great.
the extra
Yeah,
time.
excellent.
Okay. Allow me to ramble on.